Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure everything is working. So welcome. I do hope you enjoyed your lunch. I'm coming to you from Provo, Utah in the USA. And it's 6 a.m. here, so I haven't eaten breakfast yet, and you guys just got done with your lunch. So um, grateful to be here today in this meeting. Today I'm going to be talking about the functional movement screen in children. And I'm going to start off talking a little bit about fitness testing in children as we do it here in the United States, and also the functional movement screen. And then I'll be talking a little bit about some recent research that we did actually in Germany and Hungary a couple of years ago. So in children, the assessment of physical fitness in the United States, at least, started in the 1950s. And it's usually part of the physical education program here in the United States that children go through fitness assessments on an annual basis, at least, sometimes a couple times a year as part of their physical education class. And fitness testing involves the assessment of the 5 components of physical fitness, which are cardiovascular fitness, muscle strength and muscle endurance, flexibility, and body composition. And we know that the development of motor skills during childhood increases the likelihood of participation in physical activity and healthy lifestyles later in life. So there's an emergent effort to include the assessment of what we call motor competency in the regular assessment of physical fitness and physical education programs in public schools. And this is because children who have lower levels of motor skills have a higher risk of unhealthy trajectories later in life. So there's an emerging effort to include some degree of motor skill assessment as part of the normal fitness assessment in public schools. And the functional movement screen, if you're not familiar with it, includes 7 different test items. And the screening tool is used to identify functional movement limitations and asymmetries. And it allows the observation of mobility, stability, balance, coordination, muscle strength, and dysfunctional movement patterns. And 5 of the 7 test items are bilateral tests, which means we perform the test on the left side and the right side. So it allows us to assess asymmetries, or differences in quality of movement on the left and right sides of the body. And the functional movement screen of their 7 test items are all scored individually, and each one is scored on a 4-point scale, which you can see on your screen. 0 meaning they actually have pain during the movement. 1 means that they're not able to complete the movement. 2 means that there's some compensatory adjustment during the movement. And then 3 means that they performed the movement correctly. So there's a total of 21 points possible out of the 7 test items. And in children, although most of the research has been in adults, there is a increasing amount of research in children. And most of the studies in children have been done in the US, but also in a couple of other countries. We recently did a study in Hungary and Germany, and we've also done a study in Moldova, but there's been several studies in the UK. And most of the studies include only boys or only girls. there's a few studies that have included both boys and girls. So the comparison of boys and girls is somewhat limited. And most studies do not report asymmetries between the left and right sides of the body, and they do not report dysfunctional movements. And dysfunctional movements is a score of 1 on a test item, which means they were not able to complete the movement. So there's some lack of evidence in the current literature about children, and it's missing right now. So there's a lot of work to be done in using the functional movement screen in children compared to the research that's available in adults. So we performed this study in Germany and Hungary on 94 children between 10 to 12 years of age. And these were all school children. They were not involved in athletics. We actually drew these children out of their physical education classes, which in Germany and Hungary are daily physical education. And each of the children performed all 7 test items, and they performed them 3 times each. So we took the average of the 3 tests of each of the 7 test items. And we also measured percent body fat on each of the children, and we also measured other indicators of obesity and weight distribution, such as the body mass index. We also calculated their age percentile rank of the body mass index. We also measured waist circumference and hip circumference and the waist to hip ratio. And if anybody has questions, feel free to stop along the way. You don't have to wait till the end. I'm happy to entertain questions anytime that you have them, so you can feel free to interrupt and ask questions if you like. So I know there's a lot of numbers on this screen, but I just want to point out a couple of things. So remember that these test items, on the left side of your screen, you see the 7 test items. And if they're bilateral tests, you see the scores on the left and right sides. And remember that you can get a score of anywhere between 0 and 3. 3 is ideal, which means they performed the movement correctly. 0 means they have pain, and 1 means a dysfunctional score. So the main things to see on this screen is that girls performed better overall. They had a significantly higher overall test score, a total FMS score. And they also scored higher in the straight leg raise, which indicates that females, or the girls, had a greater hamstring flexibility and hip mobility in that movement. All the other test items, there was no significant difference between boys and girls. So those are the take-home messages from the test itself, as far as the scores on the individual test items. It's also important to note from these scores that both boys and girls scored the lowest on the trunk stability push-up. And this suggests that both boys and girls have poor shoulder strength, but also low levels of core stability and core strength. And we've known that about children, that they lack core stability or core strength, and this test indicates that. Okay, just a couple of comments about differences between boys and girls. There are some intrinsic factors that contribute to differences in scores between children, such as muscle activation, neuromotor control or motor control, core stability, joint mobility, and all of these factors are highly trainable. And it's important for us to remember when we're interpreting results of the FMS and comparing either boys to girls or young children to older children, or one study to another study. Because the mean scores will mask these influences of these different factors that might contribute to their performance on the functional movement screen. So it's important in studies to report scores of boys and girls and of the different ages, and perhaps of different experiences in physical activity or sports, or different levels of adiposity or obesity, so we can have appropriate comparisons. Sex differences in the FMS score are likely a reflection of differences in involvement in activities that develop neuromotor control, core stability and strength, joint mobility, coordination, and balance. So just because girls perform better than boys does not mean that they perform better just because they're a girl or just because they're a boy. It's probably because of other experiences they've had up until that point that develop muscle strength and endurance, core stability, and mobility of the joints. So we have to be cautious about how we interpret the results or the comparison between boys and girls, not only in this study, but also other studies. So some of the differences between boys and girls or between young children and older children may be due to different types of activity that they typically are involved in, either in their extracurricular activities at school, in their physical education programs, or if they're involved in sports or not. Okay, one of our interesting results of this study that we did in Germany and Hungary was reporting asymmetries. And here you see the number of asymmetries of the boys and girls in our study. What we're reporting is that 55% of boys and 68% of girls, so the vast majority of both boys and girls had at least one asymmetry, and some had two or even three asymmetries of the different tests. And we also see that boys had the most number of asymmetries in the shoulder mobility test and the active straight leg raise test, which indicates that they had low hip mobility, hamstring flexibility, and shoulder mobility. Whereas girls had the highest number of asymmetries in the rotary stability test, which tests a lot of core stability, coordination, and balance. Does anybody have any questions so far about the functional movement screen? Feel free to ask questions. The other thing reported is the number of dysfunctional scores. Now remember that they can be scored as a 0, 1, 2, or 3, and a 1 is a dysfunctional score, meaning that they could not complete the movement at all. So in this study, we see that the greatest number of dysfunctional scores, or the inability to complete the movement, was in the trunk stability push-up, which requires a lot of shoulder strength, but also a lot of core stability and core strength. So again, we're seeing that children are lacking strength and stability of the core muscles of the body, which some people think of as the abdominal muscles, but they also include the lower back muscles and things that stabilize the hips. Those are all part of the core. And of the 94 children, 86 of the children, or 92%, had at least one dysfunctional score, which means 92% of children could not complete at least one of the 7 movements correctly. All right, Asymmetries and dysfunctional scores in the FMS in children should be interpreted with caution because some asymmetries may be expected because proprioception and balance and strength and motor control are still developing as part of the normal growth and maturation of the child. Asymmetries could also be related to participation activities in sports and recreation that have asymmetrical movements, such as kicking or throwing. So if they're involved in throwing sports, such as, for example, baseball in the United States, they might have asymmetries on one side of the body, or kicking sports, such as soccer. They might have asymmetries on certain of the FMS tests. So some of their asymmetries may be due to their involvement in activities and sports that tend to be asymmetrical in the movement requirements of the sport. So not all sports use both sides of the body equally, and that's important to remember in children who are involved in recreational activities or sporting activities as a child. The other thing we reported is that out of all of the assessments of obesity that we measured percent body fat, BMI, and we also looked at their age ranking of body mass index. We also looked at the waist circumference, hip circumference, and waist to hip ratio. And all of those indicators of adiposity had negative correlations with all of the 7 test items of the FMS, which means that the higher the waist circumference or waist to hip ratio, the higher the BMI, the higher the percent body fat, the lower the FMS score. So there's a negative correlation, negative relationship between any of the measures of adiposity and performance of their FMS and each of the FMS test items and their quality of their movements. So what we noticed was that overweight and obese children scored significantly lower than underweight and normal weight children. So there's no difference between underweight and normal weight children, and there's no difference between overweight and obese children, but overweight and obese children scored significantly lower than normal weight children. And this has some significant ramifications, not only in physical education, but in interpreting the FMS score. Children who are overweight and obese have functional limitations are less likely to be physically active and will not develop functional movement patterns as well as children who do not have functional limitations. And this has consequences later in life because this puts them on an unhealthy trajectory to be not as physically active later in life as well. So this was 2 other studies have reported similar results, but there's some emerging evidence in the literature about motor skills and motor competency that obesity has an adverse effect on involvement in physical activity later in life. So this result is concerning. As with other assessments of physical fitness, not only in the public schools, but other places, we have to be really cautious how we interpret results of the FMS with the individual child, that we never want to use the result of a fitness assessment, whether it be an assessment of their cardiovascular fitness or strength or endurance or flexibility of body composition, or an assessment of their motor skills, such as the functional movement screen. We never want to use that to shame the child or to guilt the child We always want to use these results as a way to educate and to encourage children to be involved in physical activity and healthy lifestyles, but we never want to use the test results in a negative way towards the child. Okay, a couple of conclusions from this study that we made, and some other studies are available in literature, and that girls in this study had higher overall FMS scores than boys, but the differences between boys and girls and the presence of asymmetries and dysfunctional scores in young children should be interpreted in the context of the dynamic changes in strength, proprioception, balance, coordination, motor control that occur as part of normal growth and development, and also their involvement in physical activity and sports. So we have to be cautious of our interpretation of the results and understand the content of why children are scoring either low or high or higher than other children. And most children in this study and in the other studies that do report asymmetries, and there are some studies that report as high as 80% of children having asymmetries and dysfunctional scores. So most children have at least one asymmetry and at least one dysfunctional score. And poor movement quality can lead to physical inactivity later in life. And movement limitations during childhood may be due to growth-related changes in strength, proprioception, balance, motor control, and involvement in recreational activities and sports. So again, we have to interpret those results with caution depending on their growth and maturation and involvement in other physical activities. But some of these results also suggest that we can be encouraging young children of all ages and of all levels of adiposity to be involved in recreational activities and activities outside of their physical education class, and even sports if they choose to. And there's some benefit to participation in those kinds of activities that improve their motor skills and their health trajectories later on in life. And lastly, performance on the functional movement screen is negatively correlated to indicators of obesity. And children classified as underweight or normal weight perform significantly better on the functional movement screen than children who are classified as either overweight or obese. And movement competencies are more likely to develop with appropriate instruction, practice, and feedback. So in our physical education programs, it's important to be teaching not only sports, but also appropriate physical activities and motor skills, and designing physical education programs to develop motor skills and motor competencies. So children are more likely to be involved in physical activities on their own, not only as a child, but also later in life. And fitness professionals and physical educators can use the functional movement screen to identify movement dysfunctions and implement age and developmentally appropriate activities to improve motor skills as part of a physical fitness program in the public school system. The functional movement screen can be a tool to monitor positive changes in movement quality and effectiveness of their programs. So again, all of our fitness assessments can be used as an educational tool for children to educate them about physical activity and exercise and development of motor skills that improve their quality of life as a child, but also later in life as an adult. So those are the results from the study that we did and some of the conclusions that we've drawn. There are some ideas that we have for future research, and that is to be including research in large groups of students of different ages, of different experiences, and start comparing age groups and experience children of different experiences in their physical activity, and to be encouraging future researchers to be reporting all of the data, taking measures of adiposity, even taking some measures or some surveys of their involvement in physical activity and sports, so we can get a better idea of why some children are scoring low on the functional movement screen and other children are scoring higher, and trying to further define the differences between boys and girls and between young children and older children. And I think it'd be also appropriate to do some interventions. If we perform the functional movement screen early on in the school year in the physical education program to develop the physical education instruction based on the results of the functional movement screen, and then see how much children can improve over time, and use the functional movement screen to monitor positive changes in the movement quality of these children and see how it changes their involvement in other types of physical activity as they go through their physical education program at school. So that brings the study to a conclusion, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions about the functional movement screen, or about this study in particular, or about any other questions you have about fitness assessments of children. I'd be curious if any of you have any experience with the functional movement screen or with the assessment of physical fitness in whatever country that you are in, if you're involved in the public schools, or maybe your own experiences as a child, or the experiences your children have had in physical education programs in the schools that they're attending.